over 1 billion inhabitants, Africa is one of the fastest growing continents in the world today, and it's been called by all the chessboards being concerned as the continent of the future. Hello, wherever you are, a very, very warm welcome to yet another edition of your weekly international current affairs program, GLOBEWATCH, from the Cameroon radio television, the heart of the nation. If you are European watching today's program, know that the President of the European Union, his African equivalent, is my guest today. And to talk about the role of the African Parliament or the Pan-African Parliament in the development process of the continent is the President of the Pan-African Parliament, BETHEL Nnaemeka AMADI. Mr. President, thanks very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
The first session of the African Parliament was held on March 18, 2004. What concretely is the Pan-African Parliament?
A Pan-African Parliament is an organ of the African Union, which was established as a parliamentary organ that would be a platform for African people and the grassroots organizations to make an input into the decision-making process of the African Union. It was conceived to help the promotion and development of parliamentary democracy across the continent to engender good governance from our member states. And this parliament has been in existence since 2004, like you said, and currently it's in a formation that provides for it to have only advisory and consultative powers in the first 5 years of its existence.
You said of advisory and consultative powers of the Pan-African Parliament. For the moment, void of legislative powers. A toothless bulldog that barks without biting, because normally a parliament should have legislative powers.
Well, it is envisaged that the Pan-African Parliament would get legislative powers over time, would transform.
When should the African people expect that?
We think that the time is right. We think that the time is right in defined areas, clearly defined areas, without infringing on the national sovereignty of member states. The Pan-African Parliament is well positioned presently to be able to develop model laws, draft model laws, that we believe would enhance the harmonization of legislations as we provide a foundation to enhance the integration process that is ongoing. There cannot be integration without a legislative framework within which we can integrate our continent.
When you look at the creation of the Pan-African Parliament, today there are about 265 MPs from about roughly 47 countries out of the 54 following the addition of South Sudan, the last African country to become independent. Some say they are not adhering to that Pan-African Parliament because they believe that its creation, there is a problem. What do you remind them about the history of the creation of the Pan-African Parliament?
There's no problem with this creation. The vision behind the Parliament is to provide a legislative body for the African Union. The African Union, as it is presently constituted, cannot function effectively without a legislative arm to carry out what we call providing a legislative framework on which we can build the integration of our continent. We have legal instruments that are being made as charters and agreements between member states.
Let me inject an idea, Mr. President. Do you think that the Abuja Protocol of 1991, the set declaration of 1999, and the various conventions which were signed, there was a problem with them?
There's no problem. The basic agreements that produced the Pan-African Parliament were in consensus with all the normal processes for building organs of the African Union. And so the Pan-African Parliament, as presently constituted, has the legal support of all the member states. We have currently 48 members that are members of the Pan-African Parliament. And these 48 member states all have 5 members who represent them from their national parliaments. So these are elected representatives from the various member states who are participating in the processes of the Pan-African Parliament. And we believe that this gives it a grassroots input in the sense that the members are elected in the various nation states and they have the capacity to represent their countries in the Pan-African Parliament. And as such, we are now building an institution that we're convinced would, over time, be able to play a vital role. It will be a vital institution in the governance architecture of the African Union, to be able to provide it with the impetus that it requires to have a people-oriented decision-making process.
Okay. You are saying of the creation of good governance mechanisms, promotion of human rights, laws, and whatsoever in Africa. These are the key areas where the Pan-African Parliament is interested. Can you tell our audience how the Pan-African Parliament is organized for it to carry out these cardinal or canon missions?
Well, we have a bureau of the Parliament made up of the President and the 4 Vice Presidents, representing the 5 regions of the continent. And then we have committees. We have 10
Maybe
committees.
I should just tell our audience that you have been accompanied here by the Vice President for the Central African region, who is, of course, Cameroonian Nkododang, and from the West African region by a Beninese. You can go ahead, Mr. President.
Yes, we have a structure that allows for all the regions to be fully represented in the Bureau. And then we have the committees. We have 10 committees dealing with the 10 major thematic areas of health, education, transportation, ICT, agriculture, and environment. Of course, we also have a finance committee, and we have international cooperation. And so these various committees look after the various thematic areas, including the international cooperation, which is a very vital committee of the Parliament. It delves into the crisis, political crisis, peace and security issues on our continent. And the Pan-African Parliament has pronounced itself on several occasions on a lot of the major political crises and issues on our continent. Recently, we sent a very powerful delegation to Mali last year. At the beginning of the crisis, the Pan-African Parliament was the first institution of the African Union.
Inquiries to carry that?
We do have committees.
Did your fact-finding mission in Mali go there before the French intervention? And if it went there after the French intervention, why that option?
We believe that as African institution, a parliament of the African people, when there are issues on the continent, we must intervene. And we were the first institution to visit Mali after the crisis in July last year. And the findings and our resolutions and decisions that we had offered as solutions to the problems in Mali are being effected today, because the fact-finding mission, which was led by the first Vice President, the Honourable Roger Nkododang, was able to visit all the parties that were involved in the crisis in Mali. The president that then was acting, the military people who were involved, civil society, and the people of Mali. And they were unanimous in deciding that there was time for the international community to intervene. And so the Pan-African Parliament, during its session in October, considered this report, and a resolution was passed, which was forwarded to the African Union. And today, that is being implemented. And we believe that the same situation has happened in many other places that we've sent fact-finding missions. We believe that the Pan-African Parliament has a very special position and role to play in helping build peace and security on our continent.
Okay. You are talking of peace and security, but the modus operandi or the system of operation of the African Union may be interesting. The headquarters was first of all in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, before it was moved to Midrand in South Africa, where it is found today. You are in a continent which is diverse. You have Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa. What kind of parliamentary nomenclature will you prefer? A bicameral or a unicameral parliamentary system? You come from Nigeria, where you have a lower and upper house. Should the African Parliament have a lower and upper house?
I think as presently constituted in a unicameral house, it's adequate for the purpose of the functions that the Pan-African Parliament has been established to carry out. And talking about having Francophone and Anglophone and Luxophone, Arabic-speaking, it's normal. I think there should be unity in our diversity, and that diversity should be a source of strength for our continent. I believe that the people of Africa have a common problem, and that common problem is how do we find solutions to alleviate the level of poverty and suffering that exists on our continent? How do we develop our continent to give a better standard of living to our people? Those are the critical issues for our people. And it's the same for the poor man wherever you find him. The African citizen, be he in North Africa, in Sudan, in Angola, Nigeria, whatever, they have the same problems. And their issues are simple. How do they provide health care for their family, a roof over their heads, food on the table, education for their children? And those are the things that we believe our governments should focus on to provide good governance for our African citizens.
The African Union basically has three public relations institutions: the African Union Commission, the Conference of Leaders, and the African Union Parliament. How do you network? Who does what, where, how, and why?
Well, the African Union is made up of various organs, and the Assembly of Heads of States is one organ. The Executive Council, made up of the foreign ministers, is another organ. There's a PLC made up of ambassadors of the member states, another organ. The African Union Commission is also an organ and serves as the secretariat of the union. And then the Pan-African Parliament is an organ. There's the African Union, there's African Commission on Peoples and Human Rights, and there's the African Commission on People and Human Court of People and Human Rights, and so many other organs like ECOSOC that covers the civil society. Each of those organs are supposed to work together to ensure in their various spheres that the African Union does provide a platform for African people and their countries to develop, to integrate, to work together, to enhance the integration of the continent and promote things like free trade, improved intra-Africa trade amongst African nations, and to provide development for our people. Okay. So each organ has its own specific role, you know, and those roles are put together in decision-making process, and in the end, at the annual summits, those issues are brought to the summit, and decisions are taken, and agreements are made on the way forward for the continent.
Most people have described the African Parliament as the victor's parliament because of its mode of becoming a member. Those who are members of the Pan-African Parliament are deputies or parliamentarians or senators or elected officials from their various countries, and about 99.99% come from ruling parties, and so opposition parties which are represented in parliament are not found in the African Parliament. So
no, that's not correct. That's not correct.
I said critics.
No. Forget about what the critics said,
okay.
But that's not correct.
Okay.
Because the Pan-African Parliament, in its protocol, clearly says that members representing the member states at the Pan-African Parliament must be reflective of the political diversity that exists in the national parliaments. And so each delegation must have not just people from the ruling party, but representatives of the other parties that are represented in parliament.
Are you
so
sure?
Members of opposition, I'm definitely sure, members of opposition from the various member states are fully represented in the Pan-African Parliament. And we also have the gender composition taken into consideration too. So it's a
I know that the first president of the Pan-African Parliament was a woman, Mongela from Tanzania.
Mongela from Tanzania, yes.
Okay.
So we have a diversity of political opinion in the Pan-African Parliament. It is mandatory that the opposition parties are represented in the composition of the delegations that come to the Pan-African Parliament.
What is the strategy you are drawing up now to enhance peace on the continent? Because I know that, be it at the African Union Commission, be it at the Summit of Leaders of the African Union, there is one critical issue: the promotion of peace and security in Africa. Boko Haram in Nigeria, the terrorists in North Africa, the challenge in Central Africa, pirates in Somalia, and whatsoever. What concretely is the African Union Parliament doing in that area?
Yes, we are convinced that, yes, it is important to intervene when there's crisis. But we think that peace building is the essence of finding long-term solutions to these problems. We think that there should be a lot of efforts put in advance to ensure that we don't have crisis. We begin to look at issues of governance. What is the quality of governance that produces crisis and reactions from people that should be improved good governance on our continent. We look at issues of elections, and you find out a lot of times, a lot of crises in many countries are as a result of the outcome of elections. And we're saying, what are the rules? Is there a level playing field for all the political actors in member states to enable them to have free and fair elections? Do we have truly independent electoral commissions to monitor the process of elections? And so the Pan-African Parliament has been involved, not only in sending fact-finding missions to crisis areas, we've also sent fact-finding missions to areas to build peace, like what's in Sudan, North and South Sudan. We sent a fact-finding mission to North and South Sudan last year, and then to look at the border crisis that was beginning to create tension between the two member states. And so we sent our resolutions and decisions of the Parliament onto the African Union as a way forward, what we think should be done in terms of mediation in resolving the crisis and the border crisis. And then we also, as a Parliament, send election observation missions to member states to look at the election process, because sometimes it does lead to crisis after the elections, like what almost happened in Kenya some years ago. So now we're sending a delegation to Kenya, as Kenya has elections this year.
Elections will be taking place any moment from now.
Mr.
President, let's talk finances at the African Union Parliament. In 2006, Oparanya Wycliffe, who was the head of the Finance Committee of the organ you are heading, complaint of financial deficiency, and said that in that year 5 countries were providing about 75% of the finances: South Africa, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, and the other country whose name is off my memory for the moment. Have you solved all your challenges, especially the financial challenge?
Well, we are an organ of the union, and we get funds from the union. You had
about 12 billion deficit on that year.
Yes, the African Union, of course, has challenges with funding its activities. And as an organ of the union, we're affected by that process. So we do have financial handicaps. But despite the financial handicaps, because we believe that as a parliament, we are serving an African people that are not currently financially viable. And we believe that there's a lot that needs to be done. Africa is a resource-rich continent. I think the most important thing for us is how do we manage the process of resource management, resource application. You know, how do we ensure that the available resources on our continent are properly utilized to enhance the standard of living of our people? So for us at the Parliament, yes, we do have a financial concern, but we are convinced that as a people representing the African people, we need to put in our best. Despite those challenges, we need to move ahead. We need to transform our parliament. We need to have legislative functions made available to that parliament. We need to have a parliament that's able to speak for the African people, to put the input of our people into the decision-making process. Currently, as it stands today, the African Union requires a parliament that has legislative functions. Even if you're talking about finances, there are money that's already available to the African Union. There needs to be parliamentary oversight on its management and its application to ensure that it's properly utilized. And we think that this is the role for the Pan-African Parliament.
One but last question. One major issue of critique insofar as the Pan-African Parliament is concerned today is the China equation. And I want to ask a question about the award and contracting of contracts in Africa by Africans with the Chinese. Most people think that after the departure of the former colonial masters, the French, the British, the Portuguese, and whatsoever, China is coming today to invade the whole of Africa, and that the African Parliament is expected to draw up good continental legislation to ensure that contracts which are being signed are worthwhile, especially when it comes to land distribution in Africa. This is a country which constructed the headquarters of the African Union with the amount of about $200 million. Will you be hard on somebody who sponsored you?
I think that the basis of our partnership with foreign investors and all the people who come from outside our continent should be clearly defined. And I believe that the interests of African people must be protected in that whole process. Okay. And that is why at the Pan-African Parliament we have made resolutions on the issue of land grab that's ongoing across our continent. And we think that Africa, with over 70% of our population being farmers, we need to protect the interest of the African citizens to ensure that they have access to land to enable them to be able to function and produce food for their families. Okay. Because as the process is ongoing, the member states, in some situations, there's been a lot of commercial interest in acquisition of land in Africa. Some people who are speculating, and we think that this should be looked into by member states. And the Pan-African Parliament has pronounced on it. Okay. Our pronunciations have been sent to member states, their national parliaments. And we think that national parliaments should make legislations that would protect the long-term interest of the African people.
Okay, let's debate with the tomorrow of the Pan-African Parliament. How are you looking at it, and how should it look like?
The Pan-African Parliament, as a growing institution, must be empowered to carry out its functions and meet the objectives behind which the visionary founding fathers of our union established the parliament. And the Pan-African Parliament, as presently constituted today with without legislative powers, does not give it the required strength and power to carry out the functions that it needs to carry out. I'll give you an example. We are on the continent talking about free movement of people, goods and services across our continent. How do we achieve that if the process of integration requires that, when we don't have a legislative framework for that? Which national parliament can make a legislative framework that will cover the free movement of people, goods and services across our continent? Who amongst the national parliaments can make a legislation that will cover areas of intra-Africa trade, enhance intra-Africa trade, issues of trade tariffs, customs tariffs, harmonization? So these are rules that are meant for the Pan-African Parliament. And we're saying that we're not looking at Pan-African Parliament in the form that we see it in national parliaments with full legislative powers. No, we'll say that at this stage and at this point in time, the Pan-African Parliament can, in a transformational process, begin to lay the legislative framework, make model laws, which member states would not take back to their member states and domesticate and implement, with variations depending on the interests of the national member states. So we are best positioned to help the process of integration on the continent as a legislative body. And that is why the protocol that has been amended, that is now before the heads of states, has been approved by the ministers of justice and attorneys general of all member states without any reservations in May last year. That protocol needs to be approved by heads of states and needs to come into force to give the Pan-African Parliament the legislative functions that actually is missing now in the African Union governance architecture.
The President of the Pan-African Parliament, BETHEL, Nnaemeka AMADI, thanks very much for accepting our invitation on GLOBEWATCH.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for watching GLOBEWATCH from the Cameroon Radio Television, the heart of the nation. On behalf of the entire production crew, made up, as usual, of extraordinary men and women, this is Charles Ebuni in Yaoundé at our Studio 1 here in Balatu. Bye-bye.